what I would love is for my listeners to hear what you discovered about the origins of Yahweh and the name of God.
hmm So Yahweh is the Anchor Bible Dictionary puts it best. It says that there's a scholarly or it calls Yahweh a scholarly guess, right? So in other words, so let's back up. We have this challenge, which is that rabbinical Judaism forbade Jews from pronouncing the name of God, which was written 6,827 times in the most accurate manuscripts. And it's written with the consonants, but it's not pronounced. So the assumption is we don't know what the consonants are. We don't know what the vowels are, rather. So imagine if you had my letters NHM and you didn't know if it was Nuhumu or if it was Nehemi. And that's because Hebrew has two different sets of writing. It has the consonants and the vowels that are written separately. And it's generally believed that the vowels originally weren't even written. And even today, if you go to a synagogue and you pull out the Torah scroll, it doesn't have any vowels written. That is, it's just the consonants. So where do you get the vowels from? Well, you go to a printed book and you see what the vowels are, and you read it over and over until you know it, and then you go back and read the unvocalized text. That's in practice how it's done today when somebody reads in the public liturgy and the prayers in the synagogue. Now you can pick it up if you're fluent in Hebrew and read it without even practicing, and you'll get probably 95% of it right. You might make some mistakes, right? Maybe 98% you'll get right. So the problem is, what are the vowels of God's name? We know it's Yah, Ha, Va, and then the last one is Ha, which is usually silent at the end of a word. Okay, so how do we pronounce that? So the scholarly guess is that it's Yahweh, and that's based on a number of pieces of evidence. One of those is that there is a church father named Theodoret of Cyrus. And for years I called him, I mispronounced his name. And then I met like an expert in what they call church fathers. And he says, no, that's Theodoret. I always called him Theodoret because I don't know how it's pronounced. At least in English, they say Theodoret. So anyway, Theodoret says that he's speaking about the Tetragrammaton, the 4-letter name of God, which is in Hebrew, Yud He Vav He. And he says that the Jews pronounce it Ayah and the Samaritans pronounce it Yahweh. And scholars see that and they say, oh, Yahweh. Okay, well, the Jews don't know how to pronounce it. Theodoret's in the 5th century, right? This is the assumption. And but he does say the Jews pronounce it Ayah. So what is Ayah? And there's a bunch of theories about it. We won't go into that. But they say Yahweh, that's Yahweh. All right, that's piece of evidence number one. Then you have a church father named Clement, and he says, and he's earlier than Theodoret, he's like the 2nd century, and he says that the Tetragrammaton is Yahweh. And so they take those two and they say, all right, what would that be in Hebrew, right? Yahweh isn't a Hebrew word, and Yahuwah isn't a Hebrew word. So they reconstruct that it's Yahweh. Right? That's what they say today. Let's they'll say that's the evidence. That's the standard explanation. We have the Samaritan evidence from Theodoret, and Clement tells us, all right. Now, first of all, they ignore a bunch of other church fathers who say that it's Yahweh. And the only actually Jewish piece of evidence has Yahweh. Okay, well, Yahweh isn't a Hebrew name either, right? It's not a Hebrew word, right? There's some, and part of that is because there's a letter He, and He isn't pronounced in ancient Greek, right? So the He automatically drops. So Yahweh is something like Yeho something, right? Something's missing there. All right. So if you look back at where they came up with Yahweh from, one of the great promoters of Yahweh was this really a great scholar, a man named Gesenius. Gesenius was this German who, in the early 19th century, around the 1820s, he creates what later becomes the definitive grammar of Biblical Hebrew. Also, what's the definitive lexicon of Biblical Hebrew, right? So the lexicon that we used at Hebrew University of Jerusalem in Israel where most of the students are, I'm from Chicago, but most of the students were native Hebrew speakers. The lexicon we use was based on Gesenius's lexicon in German, translated into English. They used the English translation, and had gone through many different, modifications, but it was based on Gesenius's lexicon. So he was a great scholar. I don't dispute that. But he in one of the versions of his lexicon, he gives the Clement argument of Yahweh, and he gives the Yahweh, and then he gives some other pieces of evidence. But he says, well, there must be some connection. I'm paraphrasing here, but he basically says there must be some connection. You have all these ancient peoples in the Mediterranean, right? And they're all in the same area. And if you go back to the earliest period, they're all probably one big tribe. And that was something they had kind of come to through linguistics, that they realized most of the European languages, and there are some exceptions like Hungarian and Estonian, but almost all the European languages are part of a single family of languages called Indo-European languages. And so the assumption was, which is probably correct, they all go back to a single tribe, I don't know, thousands of years ago. I would say just after the flood, right? But they would probably say a different event. And they all spoke one language, and they all had a single god. And so if you have a certain god among the ancient Germans and a different god among the ancient Latins, it must all be the same god. And then they said, well, in the Mediterranean, you also have the Egyptians, who today we wouldn't say speak an Indo-European language, but they're all part maybe of the same Mediterranean culture. And they must have had a god which was the equivalent of Jupiter. Why Jupiter? Because Jupiter was the main god of the ancient Latins, of the Latin language of the Romans. Okay, well, Jupiter means actually father. Pater is father, right? It's literally the same word as father. I mean, because English is also an Indo-European language. And then Yahweh it's actually Yahweh Pater. That's the actual where you get Jupiter. So one of the forms of Jupiter is Yahweh. So Gesenius says like this: they all came from this ancient Mediterranean culture, and the Israelites, the Hebrews, must have gotten the name of Yahweh, the name of their God, from the Egyptians, which had the same God as the Latins, as the Romans. And therefore the pronunciation is Yahweh, just like it is in Latin. Right? The young people say TLDR, too long, didn't read. So the TLDR is the Hebrews got the name of their God from the Egyptians because they were slaves in Egypt, who had the same God as Yahweh, Pater, which is Jupiter. Right? So he's reconstructing the pronunciation of the Hebrew name of God, Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh, from Latin, and in ancient Latin it was Yahweh. Now, he then puts that together with Clement, and he puts that together with Theodoret, and he says, okay, there you go. It's Yahweh. Right? Now, later he drops that because he's like, wait a minute, that's not going to convince a lot of Christians that the name of their God, as it is in the Old Testament, comes from Jupiter. Right? So he drops that. But that was, you can see his pattern of thought there, right? It has to be something that's common to all the cultures of the ancient Mediterranean, and in Latin we have Yahweh. Well, Yahweh stuck. But like I said, even in the late 20th century, they're calling it a scholarly guess. All right. So, my prayer was, I want to do better than a scholarly guess. There are actually a lot of scholarly guesses. I read all these very learned academic articles where they say maybe it was originally Yahweh or Yahweh. That's based on the pattern of the name Pharaoh. Right, that's an example. Actually, Gesenius mentions that as a possibility that he rejects as well. So there's all these different theories, and what they do is they look at other Hebrew names and they say, okay, what are patterns for names? And that's like the example of Pharaoh. Or they say, well, what does it mean? And the real reason Yahweh stuck wasn't because of Jupiter. The reason Yahweh stuck is because most Bible scholars come from, let's say in America in particular, and in Germany even more so, historically at least, came from the field of theology. And in theology, they ask the question, okay, what is God? God's a creator. So whatever Yud He Vav He, however you pronounce it, it must mean creator. All right. Well, how can we get those letters to mean creator? And they say, well, Hebrew has 7 conjugations, which is correct. They're verbal conjugations. You know, in English, if you want to change the meaning of a verb, you add words to it, right? I drink. I was drinking coffee. The coffee was drunk by Nehemia, who was thirsty, right? So we have drink, drank, was drunk, is to be drunk, is to be drinking. I don't know. English isn't my expertise. So that's what you do in Indo-European languages. You do that in English. In Semitic languages, you have these verbal conjugations. So you change the vowels. That's what you do. And you add prefixes and suffixes and infixes. You do all kinds of things. You keep the 3 basic letters of the verb. Sometimes some of them drop, but you keep the 3 basic letters of the verb. And then you add prefixes and suffixes and infixes, and you modify the vowels. Mainly you change the vowels. I could take the same 3 Hebrew letters and make completely different words in English, but in Hebrew it's the same letters. So I have shavar, he broke, shiber, he smashed, and shubar, it was smashed. Okay, and I didn't change the 3 letters. It's the same 3 Hebrew, literally the same 3 Hebrew letters. All I did was change the little dots and points, and the v changed to a b based on a little dot I added to it. So that's how Hebrew works. So they said, okay, how can we get Yud He Vav He to mean he's the creator? Well, there's one of the conjugations called he feel, and it has a causative meaning. So he shbil could theoretically, it doesn't, but it could theoretically mean he causes to break. Right? It actually means he exchanges in trade, but whatever. So they say, all right, Yahweh or Yahweh in more standard Hebrew pronunciation would mean he that causes to be. And there we go. Yud He Vav He, based on our philosophy, means he's the creator. And that must be the original meaning. Okay. Well, there's one problem is that in the entire history of the Hebrew language, the word Yahweh as of or any form of that he feel of that particular root doesn't exist. There's actually one exception, but it's not with a v. It's complicated. But basically, it's a made up word in a poem from the 10th century. But other than that, it doesn't exist in Hebrew. And so you have these 7 conjugations, but not every root exists in all 7 conjugations. And the root of the word to be doesn't exist in that form. It's just a made up form. It was literally made up by scholars, right? So it's it's funny because they'll say Yehovah, which is what I found the vowels to be, and we can get to that if we have time. Yehovah is scholars will say, well, it's an impossible hybrid form. Okay, why is it impossible? Well, it's only impossible if you say it's a verb, a single form of a single verb, which it's not. Nobody says that. Whereas Yahweh is a single form of a verb, but it's a made up form. It's an impossible form. I guess it's not impossible. It's just made up, right? There's no, in other words, if you look throughout the entire history of the Hebrew language, you don't find the form Yahweh. You just don't find it, right? So how do we know it is that? Well, we just made it up, right? So could it be? Sure, anything's possible. It could be Yuhu Vuhu, right? If we don't know what the vowels are, the vowels could be anything. Right, they could be anything within the Hebrew vowel patterns, right? Hebrew consonant and vowel patterns.